Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So we have some good news in women's sports. The National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics has banned transgender athletes from women's sports. They said they're committed to fair and safe competition for all athletes, and they actually care about implementing Title IX properly to ensure that separate and equal opportunities are provided for all female athletes.
Now, the College Athletics Organization, based right here in Kansas City, has a new policy on transgender athletes. A day after a women's college basketball game got the highest rating in 5 years, the NAIA now says to compete in women's sports at that level, you have to have been born a woman. I'm Lauren Halifax.
And I'm John Holt. The new policy also says you cannot have started hormone therapy. Fox 4's Dave DeMarco live downtown where the decision was made today at the NAIA's National Convention in town. Dave.
And as you heard the organization's president tell me there, he says this is about fairness to all student athletes. The multiple groups have come out today and say this new policy isn't fair to transgender athletes.
83,000 student athletes at 241 member institutions compete in NAIA sports. But based on a unanimous decision by the Council of Presidents at the NAIA convention in Kansas City today, some of those athletes might be ineligible for women's sports starting this school year.
When we think about fairness and competition, I think it's pretty well accepted that there are male advantages in sport, strength, size, speed.
The NAIA isn't sure how many, but says transgender students have been taking part in competition. Under the new policy, anyone can compete in men's sports, but only students whose biological sex is female may participate in women's sports. And if the student has begun masculinizing hormone therapy, they can practice but can't play in external competitions. Near where that decision was made today, a youth volleyball tournament with high school students from around the nation was taking place. Most parents we spoke with seemed to agree with the decision, but didn't want to go on camera.
I mean, it's just not fair when you are taking scholarships away from collegiate athletes or high school athletes that could go on to play sports in college, and you're taking scholarships away and giving it to a male.
The nation's largest LGBTQ civil rights organization sent us a statement today saying today the NAIA decided to bar an entire category of people from competition simply because of a right-wing outrage campaign that purposefully misrepresents and distorts the realities of transgender athletes while doing nothing to support women's sports.
We certainly did not do this with any intention of making any statement about transgender students or transgender folks who want to participate in athletics. But we believe our job was to make sure that our competition was fair and that we're similar to what Title IX does. We're protecting our female category.
So still some details on exactly how this will be enforced, John. They say that they don't want to be discriminatory. They also don't want to be asking every single athlete to submit a birth certificate. So really this is just going to, like it always has, come down to the individual schools to determine their athletes' eligibility.
So they said participation by students in sports designated as male by the NAIA, all eligible NAIA student athletes may participate in NAIA-sponsored male sports. Participation by students in sports designated as female by the NAIA. Only NAIA student athletes whose biological sex is female may participate in NAIA-sponsored female sports. The NAIA said, a student who has not begun any masculinizing hormone therapy may participate without limitation. And if you have begun masculinizing hormone therapy, you may participate in all activities that are internal to the institution, does not include external competition, including workouts, practices, and team activities. Such participation is at the discretion of the NAIA member institution where the student is enrolled. External competition that is not a countable contest as defined by the NAIA. Such participation is at the discretion of the NAIA member institution where the student is enrolled.
Today, the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics banned transgender women from competing in the women's category. They also banned transgender men from competing in the men's category. They are saying that they are including us, quote unquote, but we can only play in post-season activities, which means we cannot actually compete. You may not have heard of the NAIA, but it's the second largest governing body of sports in college in the United States, the largest being the NCAA, which I competed in. This ruling is devastating, and it sets a dangerous precedent for sports governing bodies in the United States and beyond. And this decision was not based on some new medical information or some new scientific studies or discoveries that have been made. No, it was based on massive political pressure, the socio-political war that is currently being waged against trans people and specifically transgender athletes.
This is a trans man. So this person is female, who identifies as a man and competed in the male's NCAA swimming. I believe the person's name is Shula. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. But why on earth does there need to be groundbreaking research to make this decision? There have always been categories in sports. Why are we acting like that doesn't exist? I'm sorry, but you need to be treated like everyone else. You compete in the correct category. You don't get special treatment. We don't have to turn sports upside down and accept it being unfair and uncompetitive now, just so you can be affirmed in your identity. And at the end of the day, it's not going to affect men's sports as much as it's going to affect women. This is much more prevalent in women's sports, and it's having real-world consequences. First of all, there is plenty of research to support keeping women in their own category free of males. There's plenty of research. Catherine Ankerman, a former US national team rower and the chairwoman of the US Rowing Medical Committee, who has contributed to journals related to transgender athletes and presented an online lecture on the care of transgender athletes, Ankerman wrote that female athletes had 30% lower max cardiac output, 25 to 50% lower VO2 max, along with less blood and therefore less oxygen capacity. Females had about 45% less lean body mass, so that would suggest that women are 40 to 60% weaker in their upper body strength and 25% weaker in their lower body strength. And we've seen the studies that determine that being on hormones doesn't significantly reduce your advantage over women. The advantage still remains years after being on hormones. One study even said up to 8 years. So there's plenty of research, and it doesn't have to be research. This is common sense. We don't get to throw common sense out the window and force everybody to live outside of reality. Why aren't TRAs advocating for separate categories? Because they're perfectly happy to destroy women's sports. They're perfectly happy to tread all over women.
These types of bans specifically against transgender women in women's category sports are not just going to impact transgender women. These bans impact all athletes in the women's category. Because in order to exclude transgender women, you need to know which women are transgender. And this demands policing the entire women's category. At what point is a woman too fast, too strong, too good at her sport to then be accused of being transgender, accused of not being woman enough? This hurts all women, and especially those already deemed not woman enough by some system of oppression. Black women, brown women, trans women, intersex women, the list goes on. They say that transgender women are dominating women's sports, but...
You see how this person just skated over that racist remark there? Black women? What? Because you desperately want to include black women in what you're trying to promote, in your cause. Using black women to push your agenda. Absolutely ridiculous. You just threw it in there. Race and sex are two different things. And I'm sorry, all this fear-mongering about, they're going to police everybody. No. It's pretty easy to prove you're female if you're female. The only people it's going to affect are the males who are trying to fool people. It's not going to affect females. Females can prove they're female like that. We don't have to do anything out of the ordinary. A birth certificate, medical records. If it's that serious, if they really are suspicious, there's medical records. Intersex people, they still fit into the category of male and female. Some females are born with abnormalities. Some males are born with abnormalities. So stop trying to drag intersex people into this as well. Just to refresh your memory.
It makes me think about how we've also seen other women policed in a similar way, which I think, you and I've talked a lot about, something I've talked a lot about online, which is that this isn't new, right? Like you being policed this way or you being ridiculed this way is perhaps new for you, but it's not new for like women's sports, right? No. We've seen this happen repeatedly for especially Black and brown women, any woman that deviates from this like image of womanhood. And I think, I don't know, for me, it's always so important to have people remember that.
Yeah, it's very important for everybody to remember that this policing of trans women and this transphobia is not sort of isolated on its own. It's part of this broader system of trying to police people's bodies and especially women's bodies. And that comes down on mostly marginalized groups, trans women, Black and brown women.
Absolutely disgusting. We don't deviate from womanhood or deviate from the idea of womanhood. How dare you compare Black women to men so casually? We're not in the same group as trans women. Black women were segregated in sports because of racism, not because they were trying to be anywhere where they don't belong, not because they were trying to cheat. Absolutely ridiculous. So stop trying to drag Black women into this nonsense. What you're doing is advocating for the destruction of women's sports. Black women contribute to women's sports. They don't destroy it. Leah Thomas is not the same as a Black woman. No one's policing Leah Thomas's body. We know that Leah Thomas is a male and didn't belong in women's sports. It's very simple.
Most people cannot name a single trans woman who has ever won a national or international competition. And the reality is there's only a couple dozen of them in the history of sport. Trans women are not dominating women's sports. Cis people dominate sports. And if you're afraid of toxic cis men pretending to be a woman in order to win women's sports, you're still not afraid of trans women. You're afraid of toxic men. The inclusion of trans people does not threaten sports. The exclusion of us does. The NAIA's recent decision is disturbing and harmful. We need all athletes to join in this fight. So if you're interested, please hit the link in my bio and fill out that form. We need to remind everybody that trans people...
No, I'm done. So this is the same person who paints Leah Thomas out to be a victim, as we saw there. Apparently, Leah Thomas is not in that toxic men category, even though there's been evidence of Leah exercising fetishes and things like that. Getting a kick out of being in the locker room with girls. Getting some sort of gratification, dressing up as a woman. There's evidence of that, as we've seen on Instagram. So, the best way to protect women from toxic men, as you put it? First of all, aren't you misgendering the very people you claim, are women? Sounds like you're misgendering there. Sounds pretty transphobic to me. The best way to protect women from toxic men is to make sure that no male is allowed in their sports. Just like some people are saying, the guy in Planet Fitness is not really trans, or this guy, in whoever's bathroom is not really trans. The best way to protect women from those so-called imposters, because you're perfectly happy to, misgender somebody when it suits you. Apparently that's a man when it suits you. But the best way to protect women from predators and, people who are posing as trans is to ensure that males are not allowed in women's bathrooms. When you have open categories and you have the men's category, you can still participate in sports. You can even train with the women. You're just not allowed to take away their accolades, take away their wins, their places, their scholarships. When it actually counts, you're not allowed to put yourself in place of a woman when you're a male. That's all we're asking. Athlete Ally, who basically mocked female athletes and said that, they're not good enough. That's why they can't compete against male athletes. They obviously objected to this whole thing and they said, "We are dismayed by the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics decision to ban trans women athletes from women's sports. This misinformed policy goes against research and policies at the highest level of sport and does nothing to address the actual threats to women's sports. Unequal pay, sexual abuse, lack of equity in resources and more. This decision from the NAIA does not protect women's sports. It only cultivates exclusion and discrimination." NAIA President Jim Carr admits there has never been a trans woman in post-season competition in the history of the organization. So they were saying the same old thing, that it's so rare for a trans athlete to be in women's sports. It's not as prevalent as people make out. This policy is a failure of leadership by the NAIA and marks a sad day for women's sports, said Athlete Ally founder and executive director Hudson Taylor. We hope other sport governing bodies don't also succumb to political pressure and instead fight for a future of sports where everyone belongs. This is nothing but gaslighting. This isn't about political pressure. This is about doing the right thing. This is about protecting women. This is about leaving women's sports as it was, leaving it the hell alone. And I don't care whether it's one athlete or 10 athletes. No woman should be displaced because of a male athlete. Even one is one too many. Leah Thomas was the only one in the NCAA swimming. And look how much damage was caused because of that one trans athlete. And now there are more who have the same idea that Leah had. Leah wants to join the Olympics in Paris. That's going to have implications. It's going to affect records. No women's record should be held by a man. So again, I don't care whether the athlete comes 10th or 1st. I don't care whether it's one athlete or 50 athletes. Just like in the UK with the women's soccer, where there are over 50 trans athletes. So there are plenty of examples where trans athletes absolutely dominate. I mean, look at the women's cycling over in Chicago. And I'm glad the NAIA are doing the right thing. The NCAA need to do the same.
Now, while Dawn Staley is busy blocking people on social media who are adamant about keeping biological men out of women's sports, the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics was busy yesterday imposing a ban on trans athletes competing against women across all of its 241 colleges in this country. Now, are you interested in knowing how tough it was for the NAIA Council of Presidents to make this decision? Well, they approved the new policy in a 20-0 vote. If that tells you absolutely anything, absolutely unanimous. A huge win for what is believed to be the first college sports organization representing 83,000 athletes in more than 25 sports to take such a step, with the president, Jim Carr, saying this, quote, "For us, we believe our first responsibility was to create fairness in competition in the NAIA. We also think it aligns with the reasons Title IX was created. You're allowed to have separate but equal opportunities for women to compete." Now, the NCAA, under immense pressure now, obviously, they put out a response yesterday in return of the NAIA doing this, saying this, quote, "The NCAA will continue to promote Title IX, make unprecedented investments in women's sports, and ensure fair competition for all student athletes in all NCAA championships." So in other words, they said nothing.
Joining us now to discuss is journalist and author of Fair Play, How Sports Shape the Gender Debate, Katie Barnes. Katie, thank you for joining us. What do you make of the NAIA's new transgender participation policy?
Well, I think it is reflective of the times that we are in terms of, for the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen most policy updates when it comes to transgender athletes be reflective of restriction and in favor of more restrictive policy. And this seems to fall right in line with that.
There is a narrative that transgender female athletes have an advantage, that they always win, that the reason that men and women generally compete in separate gender categories is because it's not particularly competitive for men to compete against women. Do studies support that?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by support that. For my reporting and having...
Yes, studies do support that, obviously. That's why we have categories in the first place. And if we were to just take away categories and let men and women compete, women wouldn't qualify for anything. You would have to be an extraordinary female athlete to even have a chance of being competitive against men. But when it comes to the women's categories, a less than mediocre man can absolutely smash the female competition. A less than mediocre man who didn't get anywhere near that level when competing against other male athletes. He comes into the women's category though and wins, gets gold medals, gets titles, and even scholarships. So we don't need studies. Common sense tells us that there's categories, there have always been categories.
You really reported this out for many years. The reality is that from a scientific perspective, we know that there are differences in sexes, and we know that the differences do tend to lead to athletic performance differences as well. However, when we look at broad-based restriction at all levels of sport, it's very challenging to say that scientifically that is supported in all cases, meaning that something that might be appropriate for swimming does not necessarily apply to basketball when it comes to individual sports versus team sports, as well as level of competition. And so the idea, I think, that transgender women have an advantage in all sports at all times, regardless of any kind of medical transition, I don't think that the scientific literature supports that at this time.
Would there be a way to come up with a rule that was more individual specific or sport specific that might not be? I mean, it sounds as though you're suggesting, and if I'm putting words in your wrong, I apologize. In your mouth, I apologize. It sounds like you're suggesting this policy is not necessarily fair, given how blanket it is. Is there a way to do something like this that would be more fair and more reflective of what is factually known about gender differences in different sports, et cetera?
I don't know if it's right for me to say whether or not this particular policy is fair. I think that right now, where we are as a society is really grappling with what does fair and appropriate policy look like. And in general, most athletic organizations and many states across the country are embracing a blanket restriction. And I think there are a lot of people raising questions about whether or not that is fair and appropriate policy in all cases. And I do think that the jury is out on that, especially because when you look at the NIIA, there isn't necessarily a track record of transgender women competing in women's sports and dominating, right? It doesn't really seem like there is a particular problem, quote unquote, to be solved in this case.
This whole discussion is highly misogynistic. This whole discussion, they're basically discussing how they can experiment with women's sports as if we're up for their friggin' experimentation. How can we test out all the different ways we can implement men into women's sports? Let's test out all the different ways we can affirm the identity of men who want to be women. That's what this discussion is about. We're not having this discussion about men's sports, are we? Men's categories, only the women's category. This whole discussion is a disgrace. This is messing with the lives of female athletes, talented female athletes who deserve better. They're not up for your little test. They're not to be played with. I just can't even believe in 2024, this is considered progressive. This is infuriating listening to this. We shouldn't really have a blanket. You know why it's blanket? Because if you're male, you shouldn't be in the women's category. It's very simple. That's why there's a blanket ban. You shouldn't be in the women's category. There's no justification for a male athlete being in the women's category. Absolutely none. I don't care how bad the athlete is. Whether he comes, like I say, first or 10th, I don't care. He doesn't belong in the women's category. It doesn't matter how many. This is to prevent more coming in the future. But many of us could never have imagined that we would be where we are today. We have over in Australia a woman fighting to ensure that the courts recognize what an adult human female is. So yes, the NAIA are making sure that this doesn't become a huge problem in the future. And I commend the NAIA for protecting female athletes from this terrible experiment that we did not consent to.
And so in general, I think the real question is going to be what policy can withstand being tested and be accepted when a transgender woman does compete and win. And it seems like right now the answer to that question is looking to remove any possibility of a transgender woman being able to participate and compete in women's sports at a variety of levels, and in this case, including collegiately.
Do we have any idea what the numbers are of transgender athletes that are participating in college or university athletics, or even junior high or high school athletics? I mean, the amount of coverage and attention it gets is significant, and I don't know how many people we're even talking about necessarily.
We're talking about a very small number of people. I think that's really important to acknowledge, especially now that 24 states have passed restrictive policies, passed restrictive legislation, that affects K through 12 and often college sports. And so in about half the country, transgender girls and women don't have access to girls and women's sports at this time anyway. And in those states where you still have transgender girls and women eligible to participate in girls and women's sports, the numbers that are doing so are not necessarily known. It's not a data set that is readily available. But from the reporting that I've done over the years, the accepted number, so to speak, is very small and very few. Oftentimes in states where this has been debated and a number of athletes have come forward who are younger, who are talking about their experiences, we're talking about single digits in each state. And in the collegiate ranks, even though like the NCAA, for example, supports sports that have about 500,000 athletes across 24 sports at all three divisions, you're still looking at a very small number. Probably, I mean, we don't know it specifically, but I've been told from sources that it's well under 100. And so that are actively using the NCAA's policy. And in the NAIA, we don't really know how many known athletes there are. And it only takes one athlete to win a championship. And it takes one athlete to win a tournament. And it takes one athlete to get a scholarship. It doesn't matter how many. They shouldn't be there in the first place, not in the women's category. There's only one first place for each tournament. There's only one championship title. So that's all it takes. There's only one record in each category of, event. There's only one record in the women's 100 meters. There's only one record in the women's 500 meter freestyle. That's all it takes. It doesn't matter how many. It matters that they're there in the first place and they can take a record, they can take a title, a championship or a place and displace women who are there rightfully because that's who the sports is for. So yes, that whole discussion absolutely disgusted me because women are not to be played with. Women are not to be part of your experiment. Women are not to be collateral damage. If a woman has her record taken by a man, whoops. If a woman misses out on a scholarship because of a male athlete, whoops. No, it's unacceptable. So I'm glad to see that common sense has prevailed with the NAIA, and I hope it happens with the NCAA. I'm not going to hold my breath at the moment, but, glad to see that they're being taken to court at least. And it's also good to hear from former basketball players, former WNBA basketball players who also have common sense. Val Whiting wrote this on X yesterday. A lot of my basketball sisters feel differently, but trans women do not belong in women's sports. It's not fair, nor safe for biological women. There has to be another solution for trans women to be able to compete athletically, besides having to compete against biological women. That should be the experiment. Thinking of different ways to accommodate transgender athletes in a way that allows them to compete, in a gender-affirming capacity, other than being in the women's category. That's what you should be discussing. A third category, an open category, or how you can, accommodate them in the correct category that aligns with their biological sex. That's what you should be discussing, not experimenting with women's sports at all levels, regardless of how it affects women and little girls. That's unacceptable. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Take care of yourselves, and God willing, I will see you in the next video.